Hi guys, welcome back. We're on chapter 10 today. Ready? It was only a few more days before Lavina was well enough for us to move on. Mother fixed up a bed for her in the wagon. I was eager to make up for all the times I had refused to play with her. Giving up my walking, I read aloud to her and invented new games with our dolls to amuse her. Every day she seemed to grow stronger. Soon she was sitting up and laughing, and we were sewing on our quilt blocks together. The long rest had done our animals good. Their tender feet and sore shoulders had healed, and they moved along easily. Walking in the deeply rutted road, the oxen needed only Father's voice and an occasional snap of a whip to guide them, so he was able to ride and get some much needed rest too. All the way up the Platte, we had encountered brief, hard thunderstorms that pelted us with rain and hail until the wagon cover was drenched, and dampness drifted down on us like mist. So we were not surprised one afternoon when the sky suddenly turned dark, and thunder muttered threateningly in the distance. But within a few minutes, the sky was as black as midnight. Rain fell in pounding sheets, and thunder shook the earth as it would beneath us, as if it would tear us apart. "Hold on to Buck!" I heard Father shouting to John. The men had unhitched the oxen from the wagon and were holding them by the horns to keep their frightened animals from running away. Already rain had soaked all the way through the wagon cover. The wind was shaking our wagon so hard, flapping and shrieking that it seemed like it might blow away like a tumbling leaf. Lavina and I held on to each other, our clothes dripping wet, but we were not as wet as Father and John standing out in the storm. I could barely make out the hunched figures talking to the oxen. "Easy now, Ben. Steady, Buck." Then a blinding shaft of light came down out of the sky and struck the Grant's wagon. I saw it run around the iron rim of the wheel like a great ball of fire. "What is it?" gasped Lavina. "Lightning," answered Mother, her voice steady and calm. Cynthia whimpered in her arms. Instinctively, Lavina and I moved closer to her. Huddling against my mother's damp skirts was as more thunder crashed and lightning stabbed the darkness with long knives of white. Never had I felt so wet and scared. Yet there was something comforting about all of us being together, gathered around Mother as if taking shelter beneath the branches of a tall, unbending tree. At last the thunder faded into the distant rumble. The rain became only a steady drip, drip. And that word is onomatopoeia. And when I looked outside again, the sun was breaking through the clouds. Father and John were soaked through, and all the animals looked bedraggled, but everyone was safe. We soon discovered, however, that the wagons were standing in 2 feet of water. The men had to drive the reluctant oxen back into all that water, hitch them up, and pull us out. It took a whole day to dry out Father's clothes. The next afternoon we passed Chimney Rock, a tall stone spire that rose abruptly out of the plains into the sky. To me, it looked like a church steeple pointing to heaven. And soon after that, we were in Wyoming. The soil seemed different now, the roads more rocky than sandy, and the country was beginning to look more like mountains. Okay, if you go back to the front of the book here, Chimney Rock is place number 4 on our map here. So they're getting a little bit closer, aren't they? Ever since Mr. Grant had killed his first antelope, he kept going out on hunting expeditions, full of hope and determination. We had all had a longing for fresh meat, having grown thoroughly tired of our usual diet of bacon, gravy, bread, and molasses. But the antelope were so fleet of foot that a horse had little chance of overtaking them. In a sudden burst of speed, they would bound away, heads held high, white rumps disappearing in a cloud of dust. So Mr. Grant usually returned tired and discouraged. One afternoon, after we had made an early camp, he decided to go out into the nearby low hills in search of game. Mounting his horse, he waved cheerily to the family and rode away. Mealtime came, and Mr. Grant did not come back. Darkness began to settle over the camp, and still he did not appear. Mr. Grant and David came to our campfire. "What could have happened to him?" Mrs. Grant asked. Her small, thin face looked pinched, and her eyes were bright with worry. Father tried to assure her. Perhaps he killed some game as evening was coming on, he suggested. He would have to carry it on his horse and walk in, and that would take time. David, who usually didn't say very much, spoke up then. His voice shook a little, but his dark eyes were determined. I think I should go out and look for him. Father looked at him with sympathy, but shook his head. It's too late for that. You would only get lost in the dark yourself. We must wait until morning. He lit the Grant's lantern and our own and hung them up as a guide for Mr. Grant to find our camp in the darkness. The lanterns burned all night, but in the morning he had still not come. At daybreak, when Father went out to saddle his horse, he discovered Mr. Grant's horse still saddled, grazing with others. His eyes were grave as he walked back to our wagon. We are going to have to go out and look for him, he told Mother. After a hurried breakfast, Father and David Grant set off into the hills together. Each of them carried a canteen of water, lunch, and a small bottle of stimulant. They trailed Mr. Grant's horse behind them. If only, I thought as I watched them ride away, that horse could talk and tell them which way to go. John had been left behind to take care of the stock and watch over the rest of us. From the way he strode around, his hands on his hips, hat pushed back on his head, I could tell he was feeling his importance as the only man in camp. John had changed in the time since we left Arkansas, I realized suddenly. Although he was still thin, he had filled out in some way that I couldn't quite put a finger on. His arms and legs seemed a better match for his body now. There was a little swagger of confidence in his walk. Even his voice had begun to settle into a deeper register. As soon as Father and David left, Mother and Mrs. Grant brought out their large wooden washtubs and tried to keep busy doing the washing. But all of us kept stopping every few minutes to peer into the bright distance, watching and waiting. Noon came, and they had not returned. A merciless sun beat down, forcing us to seek shelter in the shade of the wagons. Mother and Mrs. Grant took out their mending, while Lavinia and Cynthia played with a yarn ball. Idly, I picked up Father's whip and tried again to crack it the way he did. But it was still too heavy for me. Disappointed, I put it down and went to get my sewing. I could hear Mother talking, going on about nothing. That boy has done it again. Just look at the tear in this shirt. I tell you, I don't know how I'm going to keep him in clothes the way he's going. He'll end up wearing rags before we're through. She talked on and on about biscuit recipes and the latest words Cynthia was learning to say. I knew she was trying to distract Mrs. Grant and keep her from worrying. Time crept slowly by. About mid-afternoon, a train of 6 wagons passed near us. One man stopped to ask if we needed help, and Mother told him about Mr. Grant. If he's lost out there, the man said, waving his dusty black hat in the wide circle, it ain't likely he'll never be found. Mrs. Grant nearly collapsed at that, and Mother had to help her to a chair in the shade of the wagon. Don't pay any attention to him, Martha, she said soothingly. That man doesn't know Thomas. Why, he doesn't know anything at all. The afternoon wore down into evening. John went to milk the cows and put out the salt that had kept them from straying. The sun was beginning to set off to the west, lighting up the land with deep pink and purple shadows. But today none of us was interested in a beautiful sunset. We squinted into the sun and still straining to see. Just as the last rays of sun sank below the horizon, I climbed up on the still warm tongue of the wagon to take a long last look. Dimly outlined against a distant hill, I thought I saw something moving. Was it just my imagination, or could it be real? I closed my eyes, then opened them and looked again. Yes, I said out loud. It's men on horses. Everyone gathered to look. I think I see 3 horses, John said excitedly, but one has no rider. No, wait, there is something on that horse too. Can it be a man all doubled up? Slowly the figures drew nearer. I could make out Father riding Polly and David Grant on his horse, and an extra horse between them. Both Father and David seemed to be reaching toward a bundle on Mr. Grant's horse. Minutes later they came riding into camp. I stared, my mouth falling open in disbelief. Mr. Grant was wrapped up in Father's coat, his eyes so bleary and his face so purple and swollen that I hardly recognized him. Get his bed ready, ordered Father. Quick! He and David lifted down the limp-paunched form and carried it to the Grant's tent. "Thomas!" cried Mrs. Grant, reaching out her hand. He tried to reply, but all that came out was a muffled groan. In a few minutes Mr. Grant was settled into bed, his worn shoes and torn clothing removed. Very gently Mrs. Grant washed his face, and she and Father fed him spoonfuls of medicine and hot milk. After a time he fell into a feverish sleep. "Will he be all right?" Mother asked in a hushed voice when Father finally returned to our wagon. "They will likely be up with him most of the night," he replied. "He needs nourishment, and the fever must be kept down. With care he should recover. But if we had not found him when we did, he surely would have died." While Mother fixed him some supper, Father described how they had found Mr. Grant. He was lying out in the sun near a small bush. As we approached, he waved his hands, but he could not speak. His lips and tongue were dark and swollen. I tried to give him a drink, but he couldn't even swallow. So we moved him into the shade of a bush. We let water drip onto his tongue and washed his face and hands. After a while, we mixed a little stimulant into the water and let it run down his throat. By that time, the sun was setting, and I knew we had to get him back to camp.